General Schross stared at the pathetic blue-green marble spinning below his flagship and wondered, not for the first time, why the universe insisted on wasting his time with such tedious conquests. Ventari Prime, he growled, his bone-plated jaw clicking in irritation. A burnt Terran rock with delusions of relevance. Why are we here again, Commander? His aide, a nervous Qatari named Vixel, consulted his datapad with trembling claws. Strategic resource evaluation, sir. The colony reportedly contains pre-collapse Terran technology. Pre-collapse Terran technology, Sross repeated slowly, as if tasting something unpleasant. You mean the species that vanished 70 years ago and left behind nothing but broken satellites and very loud warning signs? Yes, sir. That's exactly what I mean, sir. Sross turned back to the viewport, watching his fleet of 17 Valkoran dreadnoughts maintain perfect siege formation around the little colony world. It was like using a sledgehammer to swat a particularly stubborn fly, but the Spiral Concordat's orders had been explicit. Secure all Terran artifacts, no matter how insignificant the location. Status report on their defenses? He asked. Minimal, sir. Orbital shield grid collapsed 12 minutes ago. Surface installations are minimal. They're basically helpless. Excellent. Prepare for. Sir, the communications officer's voice cracked with excitement. We're receiving a transmission from the surface, audio only. Put it through. Static filled the bridge, followed by a distinctly human-sounding voice that was far too cheerful for someone facing imminent conquest. Hello there. This is Dr. Jakob Fenn, temporary spokesperson for the Ventari Prime Welcoming Committee. I understand you're here for some light pillaging and conquest? Sross's bone plates shifted in confusion. This is General Schross of the Valkoran War Fleet. You will surrender immediately or face. Oh, wonderful. A general, how delightfully official. Tell me, General, do you happen to know anything about gravitational physics? Because I have the most fascinating experiment planned, and you've arrived at exactly the right moment to help. The bridge fell silent. Schross looked around at his crew, who were all staring at the communications console as if it had just started speaking in tongues. Is he inviting us to participate in science? Whispered Commander Vixel. I believe he is, Schross said slowly. How unusual. Meanwhile, 3,000 kilometers below, Defense Officer Nara Lin was having what could generously be described as the worst day of her military career. The outer shield grid had collapsed, the orbital defense platforms were offline, and their last hope was apparently a relic bunker that had been sealed since before she was born. She stood before the massive blast door marked Project Gravitas Classified and tried to remember the emergency protocols. The authorization codes were simple enough. In case of absolute emergency, when all other options were exhausted, open the bunker and pray. The door cycled open with a hiss that sounded distinctly disappointed. Inside, emergency lighting revealed banks of pre-collapse computers, stacks of theoretical physics journals, and what appeared to be a small kitchenette. At a desk in the center of it all sat a man in his 50s, wearing mismatched socks and sipping tea from a mug that read, Gravity. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. He looked up as Nara entered, blinked once, and smiled. Ah, excellent. I was wondering when the apocalypse would knock. Dr. Fenn, Nara said weakly. Dr. Jakob Fenn, but you're supposed to be dead, missing, presumed vaporized along with the rest of Terran civilization? Jacob stood up and brushed imaginary dust off his remarkably wrinkled lab coat. Yes, well, reports of my demise have been greatly exaggerated. Also, I've been having the most productive decade of research. Do you know how much you can accomplish when people stop interrupting you with meetings? Sir, we're under siege. 17 Valkoran dreadnoughts. They're demanding surrender. 17? How wonderfully symmetrical. And Valkoran, you said? Oh, this should be fun. They're the ones with the gravity bombs, aren't they? Yes, sir. Very big gravity bombs. Jacob clapped his hands together with genuine delight. Perfect. I do so love it when people bring the right equipment to the wrong fight. Computer, begin personal log, Jacob said, settling back into his chair while Nara stood in stunned silence. Day 3847 of voluntary isolation. The universe has finally decided to provide me with test subjects. Note to self, remember to thank the universe later. Possibly with extreme prejudice. Dr. Fenn, Nara interrupted, I hate to interrupt your logging, but we're about to be conquered by a species that considers torture an art form. Are you familiar with my work, officer? Lynn, Nara Lynn. And yes, sir, I was one of your students at the academy. Before the collapse. Jacob's eyes lit up. Nara, of course, you wrote that delightful paper on quantum entanglement and breakfast cereal. How is breakfast cereal these days? Still crunchy, sir. Excellent. Consistency is important in breakfast foods and in physics. Jakob stood up and walked to what appeared to be a periscope, attached to a small floating drone covered in warning stickers. Meet Mittens, my gravitational reconnaissance unit. Mittens, say hello to my former student. The drone bobbed slightly. A small screen on its side displayed what looked suspiciously like a winking emoticon. You named your military equipment Mittens? I name all my equipment. It helps build rapport. Plus, Mittens gets lonely. Jakob peered through the periscope, adjusting dials that probably shouldn't exist. Oh my. Your Valkoran friends have quite the impressive fleet up there, 17 dreadnoughts, each one equipped with Class 7 gravity manipulation systems. How wonderfully inefficient. Inefficient. They're trying to use gravity as a weapon, Nara. That's like trying to perform surgery with a volcano. Technically possible, but it shows a profound lack of imagination. Nara watched Jakob manipulate controls that seemed to have been assembled from spare parts and wishful thinking. Sir, with all due respect, how exactly do you plan to defeat 17 dreadnoughts with a drone named Mittens and a decade-old cup of tea? Oh, I'm not going to defeat them conventionally. That would be boring. Jacob straightened up, his eyes gleaming with the particular madness of a physicist who'd spent too long alone with his theories. I'm going to make them question reality itself. I'm sorry, what? The thing about reality, Nara, is that it's surprisingly flexible if you know where to push, and I've spent 10 years finding all the best places to push. He turned to face her, and she realized with growing alarm that he was completely, utterly serious. I need 3 things: a quantum relay dish, 2 satellites with broken orbital gyros, and all available tea. Tea? Physics is thirsty work. Also, caffeine helps with the mathematics. Before Nara could respond, Jakob was already moving, pulling dusty equipment from storage containers and muttering to himself about eigenvalue fluctuations and the inherent comedy of spacetime. Dr. Fenn, she called after him, what exactly are you planning? He paused at the bunker entrance, arms full of devices that definitely hadn't existed before the collapse. I'm going to teach those Valkorans something very important about human physics, Nara. Which is? Jacob grinned, and for a moment, she could see exactly why her professors had called him both a genius and a potential threat to universal stability. That we don't just break the rules, we make the rules beg for mercy. 6 hours later, Nara found herself perched on a makeshift observation platform, watching Jakob wire together what could charitably be described as the most dangerous collection of jury-rigged equipment in the known galaxy. Remind me again, she said, why we're connecting a quantum relay dish to a coffee machine. Because, Jakob explained patiently, adjusting something that sparked ominously, the coffee machine contains a microfusion heating element that, when properly calibrated, can generate exactly the right frequency to synchronize with gravitational lensing effects. And the rubber duck? That's for luck. Also, it helps me think. Through the reinforced observation window, they could see the Valkoran fleet maintaining perfect siege formation. Every few minutes, General Schross would fire a warning shot into the upper atmosphere, just to remind everyone who was in charge. Phase 1, Jacob announced, activating a control panel that looked like it had been designed by someone with a degree in both engineering and abstract art. Operation Gravitic Turnabout. Watch this. The quantum relay dish began to hum, vibrating with harmonics that made Nara's teeth ache. On the screens around them, strange readings began to appear. Gravitational distortions that shouldn't exist. Spatial curvatures that defied explanation. What are you doing? She whispered. I'm using gravitational lensing to bend light around our stealth drones, Jakob said, his fingers dancing across controls with the precision of a concert pianist. To the Valkoran sensors, it will look like hundreds of ships emerging from nowhere. On the main display, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The space around Ventari Prime suddenly filled with what appeared to be an entire fleet of Terran vessels, sleek, threatening, and completely impossible. Aboard the Valkoran flagship, alarms began screaming. Sir, Commander Vixel's voice cracked with panic. Massive fleet emergence, unknown class vessels appearing from nowhere. General Schross stared at the tactical display in disbelief. That's impossible. Our sensors showed empty space. Sir, they're surrounding us. At least 200 vessels, maybe more. It's spec. How did they? They didn't, Schross said slowly. This is some kind of trick. But even as he spoke, something impossible happened. The rearmost dreadnought, the bone crusher, suddenly lurched sideways as if grabbed by an invisible hand. Warning lights flashed across its hull as the ship was pulled into what the sensors could only describe as a gravitational anomaly of unknown origin. Sir, the science officer announced, his voice hollow with confusion, the physics just attacked us. Sross turned to stare at him. Explain. I can't, sir. According to our instruments, the bone crusher was just crushed by a gravity well that shouldn't exist, created by a black hole that isn't there, using principles that violate at least 14 laws of physics. How is that possible? It's not, sir. That's the problem. Down on Ventari Prime, Jacob was practically bouncing with excitement. Oh, this is going even better than I hoped. Look at them scurrying around like confused beetles. You created a fake black hole? Not fake exactly, more like borrowed. I'm using gravitational resonance to create an echo of a black hole that collapsed 3 million years ago. The gravity is real, but the source is cosmologically historical. Oh. Nara stared at him. That doesn't make sense. Of course it doesn't make sense. If it made sense, everyone would be doing it. Jakob activated another control sequence. Phase 2. Now we're going to make their weapons shoot themselves. The quantum relay dish shifted focus, and suddenly the space around the Valkoran fleet began to shimmer with what could only be described as visual echoes. Every ship was reflected multiple times, creating a kaleidoscope of false targets. Fire control is compromised, came the panicked voice from the Valkoran fleet. Our targeting systems are detecting echoes. Firing solutions are returning impossible coordinates. General Schross watched in growing alarm as his perfectly disciplined fleet began firing at shadows, their gravity bombs curving through space in directions that made no geometric sense. How is this happening? He demanded. His science officer had given up on instruments entirely and was now staring out the viewport with the wide-eyed expression of someone watching reality have a nervous breakdown. Sir, he said quietly, I think we're fighting someone who understands physics better than physics understands itself. Dr. Fenn, Nara said, trying to keep her voice level, please tell me you have a plan beyond confuse the enemy until they go away. Jacob paused in his manipulation of what appeared to be a gravity generator built from spare parts and good intentions. Actually, that was pretty much the plan. Why? Is it not working? It's working too well. You've got an entire Valkoran fleet questioning the nature of reality. Excellent. That means they're ready for Phase 3. Jakob moved to a console she hadn't noticed before, one that hummed with an altogether different kind of energy. Time to wake up an old friend. He placed his hand on a palm scanner that chirped cheerfully before activating a holographic interface. Text began scrolling across the display. Veil protocol initialization status, dormant, 3,847 days, secure Jacob, theoretical physicist, level Omega. Warning, activation requires justification. Jakob typed, Valkoran fleet making physics sad. Please assist with remedial education. A new voice filled the bunker, crisp, professional, and deeply, profoundly unimpressed. Dr. Fenn, you've activated me for the first time in over a decade to help you fight a war using improvised equipment and what appears to be a profound disregard for the structural integrity of space-time. Hello, Vale. Lovely to hear from you again. I am an advanced artificial intelligence designed for strategic defense analysis, not for enabling your increasingly exotic interpretations of theoretical physics. But you'll help anyway, won't you? A pause. Then, with the tone of someone who dealt with Jakob Fenn before, what do you need? I need you to run a 7-dimensional echo algorithm on broken hardware to create delayed spatial reflections using gravitational lensing effects. You want me to make enemy ships see targets behind where they actually are. Exactly, using equipment held together with hope and coffee stains. The coffee stains are structural. Another pause, longer this time. Dr. Fenn, do you want me to ruin space-time or just deeply inconvenience it? Inconvenience will be fine. We're not trying to end the universe, just this particular siege. Very well. Initiating temporal spatial displacement protocols. Please note that this will likely result in several violations of fundamental physical laws. The best plans usually do. As Vale began working, the space around Ventari Prime became even stranger. The Valkoran ships were now seeing targets that existed 3 seconds in the past, firing at positions their enemies had already vacated, and watching their own weapons curve through space in directions that made their navigation officers weep. Sir! Commander Vixel's voice had reached a pitch that suggested either hysteria or a fundamental misunderstanding of vocal cord limitations. Our torpedoes are boomeranging. We fired at coordinates 47 Delta, and the weapons somehow ended up behind us. General Sross sat heavily in his command chair, staring at tactical displays that showed his fleet firing in perfect formation at absolutely nothing, while being systematically confused by what appeared to be weaponized geometry. Science officer, he said quietly, in your professional opinion, what are we fighting? The science officer looked up from his instruments, his scales pale with shock. Sir, I believe we're fighting someone who's turned physics into a practical joke. Down in the bunker, Jakob was practically glowing with satisfaction. Oh, this is wonderful. Look at them trying to figure out where reality went. Dr. Fenn, Nara said carefully, you realize you're essentially driving an entire fleet insane? Not insane, exactly. More like educationally challenged. They came here expecting a conventional battle. Instead, they're getting a graduate-level seminar in theoretical physics. Taught by someone who apparently thinks the laws of physics are more like suggestions? Jakob paused in his work and looked at her with genuine surprise. Nara, he said seriously, physics isn't about laws. Physics is about understanding how the universe works so you can politely ask it to work differently. The universe usually says yes if you ask nicely. And if it says no, Jakob grinned and returned to his controls. Then you weren't asking nicely enough. Phase 4, Jacob announced, activating systems that probably shouldn't have existed and definitely shouldn't have been humming that particular tune. Time for a little musical appreciation. Musical? Nara watched him align 2 orbital stations on his display, their positions forming what looked suspiciously like a musical staff. Dr. Fenn, please tell me you're not about to play music with gravity. Not with gravity, Jakob corrected. With space-time itself. There's a difference. Gravity is just the melody. Space-time is the entire orchestra. Vale's voice cut through the bunker with what sounded like digital resignation. Dr. Fenn, you're attempting to create harmonic resonance in the gravitational field using orbital mechanics. This is either brilliant or catastrophically dangerous. Why not both? Because, Vale said patiently, the last time someone tried to play music with gravitational fields, they accidentally created a temporal anomaly that made last Tuesday happen on Thursday. That was different. I've refined the technique since then. When did you? Never mind. I don't want to know. Jacob's fingers moved across the controls with the precision of a concert pianist, adjusting orbital positions and gravitational resonance frequencies. The 2 stations began moving into alignment, their paths creating complex harmonics in the fabric of spacetime. What you're witnessing, Jakob explained to Nara, is called a collapse fold. By creating standing waves in the gravitational field, I can generate temporal spatial distortions that affect the flow of time itself. You're making time hiccup? More like making it sneeze. Watch this. The effect on the Valkoran fleet was immediate and disorienting. Ships that had been moving in perfect formation suddenly found themselves experiencing time at different rates. Orders transmitted from the flagship arrived at their destinations 3 seconds before they were sent. Weapons fired before the targeting systems locked on. Navigation computers began reporting that they were simultaneously arriving at and departing from the same location. Sir! Commander Vixel's voice now sounded like it was coming from underwater. The temporal sync is failing. I just received orders I haven't sent yet. General Sross watched his carefully coordinated fleet dissolve into chaos as each ship began operating on its own timeline. The Blood Thunder flickered in and out of existence, apparently caught in a temporal loop. The Skull Render fired its entire ammunition complement at a target that wouldn't exist for another 17 seconds. And then, impossibly, one of his ships simply vanished, only to reappear inside another ship's cargo bay, resulting in an implosion that somehow happened in reverse. Science officer, Strauss said in the tone of someone who had given up on understanding the universe. What just happened? Sir, according to the instruments, the marrow grinder just time traveled through the Death Strike, and they both exploded in a temporally paradoxical fashion. Is that possible? No, sir. But it happened anyway. Down on Ventari Prime, Jacob was practically dancing around his control station. Oh, that was beautiful. Did you see that temporal inversion? The explosion happened before the cause. Dr. Fenn, Nara said, her voice tight with concern, you're not just breaking physics anymore. You're making it cry. Physics is surprisingly resilient, Jakob assured her. It can take more abuse than you'd think. Besides, look how well it's working. He gestured to the main display where the Valkoran fleet was in complete disarray. Ships were firing at targets that existed in different time zones, missing each other by decades, and generally behaving like a military force that had been hit with a reality-altering weapon. Which, Nara reflected, was exactly what had happened. Are they retreating? She asked hopefully. Jacob consulted his instruments, frowning slightly. No, they're regrouping. Impressive, really. Most species would have fled screaming by now. So what's Phase 5? Jacob's grin widened, and Nara realized with growing alarm that he'd been saving the best for last. Phase 5, he said, is where we get creative. Computer, Jacob announced to the bunker at large. Initiate final phase. Authorization. Fen Delta 77. Impossible. Warning lights began flashing throughout the facility. Emergency klaxons sounded. Somewhere in the depths of the bunker, machinery that had been sleeping for decades began to wake up with the kind of sounds that suggested it was deeply unhappy about being disturbed. Dr. Fenn, Vile's voice carried a note of what could only be described as digital concern. That authorization code will activate the experimental singularity projector. I know. The untested, potentially catastrophic, definitely dangerous experimental singularity projector. I know. The one with the warning label that says, do not use unless reality is ending? Reality isn't ending, Jacob said cheerfully, but this siege is about to be. Nara, you might want to stand back. This next bit gets a little exciting. Nara moved to what she hoped was a safe distance, which, given that they were about to activate experimental singularity technology, was probably somewhere on the other side of the galaxy. What exactly is a singularity projector? She asked. Think of it as a holographic black hole, Jacob explained, his hands moving over controls that were now glowing with ominous energy. All the gravitational effects, none of the inconvenient matter consumption, perfect for confusing the enemy. That sounds safe and reasonable. Oh, it's neither safe nor reasonable, but it is effective. On the main display, Jacob was creating what appeared to be an entire fleet of shadow constructs, light-bending illusions so sophisticated they triggered the Valkoran targeting systems and generated actual sensor returns. Decoy fleet deployment, he announced. Each ship composed entirely of folded light and gravitational shadows. To enemy sensors, they'll appear completely real. Aboard the Valkoran flagship, the confusion was reaching epic proportions. Sir! The tactical officer's voice cracked with strain. New contacts, massive Terran fleet emerging from everywhere. General Strauss stared at a display showing hundreds of human ships surrounding his forces in perfect battle formation. His own instruments confirmed their presence, their weapon signatures, even their hull compositions. How many? He asked warily. 417 confirmed vessels, sir, all broadcasting Terran Command identification codes. Terran Command has been dead for 70 years. Yes, sir. They seem to have gotten better. Strauss studied the tactical display, his strategic mind analyzing formations and attack vectors. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. It's an illusion, he said finally. It has to be. Sir, if it's an illusion, it's one that's registering on every sensor we have. Then test it. Target the largest vessel. Full spread of gravity torpedoes. Sir, yes, sir. Down in the bunker, Jacob watched the incoming attack with satisfaction. Perfect. They've taken the bait. What bait? Nara demanded. The largest shadow ship, Jacob explained, happens to contain an actual micro-singularity. When they target it, the Valkoran gravity torpedoes struck Jacob's decoy fleet flagship with tremendous force. For a moment, nothing happened. Then reality hiccuped, space folded in on itself, and the attacking torpedoes were caught in a gravitational eddy that spun them around, accelerated them to impossible velocities, and launched them back at the Valkorn fleet at roughly twice their original speed. But that wasn't the impressive part. The impressive part was what happened to the space around the impact point. Jakob's microsingularity didn't explode. It displaced. The gravitational shockwave created a bubble of twisted space-time that caught the entire Valkoran fleet and carried them somewhere else entirely. Not destroyed, not damaged, just relocated. Several hundred light years away, General Strauss opened his eyes to find his entire fleet floating in empty space, surrounded by unfamiliar stars. "Navigator," he said quietly, "where are we?" "Unknown, sir. According to the charts, we're in the middle of nowhere. The nearest star system is 400 light years away." "How did we get here?" "I don't know, sir. One moment we were attacking a target, the next moment we were here." On Strauss's command screen, a new transmission was coming through, clear, strong, and unmistakably human. "General Strauss," came Jakob's cheerful voice, "I hope you enjoyed your little tour of advanced Terran physics. Consider this a gentle demonstration of what happens when you bring gravity bombs to a reality fight." Strauss stared at the communications panel in disbelief. "How are you transmitting across hundreds of light years?" "Oh, that's simple," Jakob replied. "I'm using quantum entanglement through collapsed dimensions. The signal is taking a shortcut through space-time, very efficient, though it does use quite a lot of power." "This is impossible." "General, I've just relocated your entire fleet using a weaponized shadow puppet show and a microsingularity hidden in a hologram. I think we've established that impossible is more of a guideline than a rule." There was a long pause before Strauss spoke again. "What do you want?" "Nothing at all. You came to conquer a peaceful colony, and instead you've received a comprehensive education in theoretical physics. I'd call that a fair trade." "And if we return?" Jakob's voice carried a note of genuine amusement. "General, I have 17 more experimental physics projects in this bunker, and I've been very, very bored for the last 10 years. Please feel free to return anytime you'd like to help me test them." The transmission ended, leaving General Strauss staring at the empty space around his fleet and contemplating the fact that he'd just been defeated by someone who treated the laws of physics like suggestions. 2 hours later, Nara found Jakob sitting on the observation platform, sipping tea and watching the stars. The bunker had returned to its previous state of peaceful humming, though several pieces of equipment were still glowing in ways that probably violated international safety regulations. "So," she said, settling down beside him, "that happened." "Yes, it did. Quite successfully, too." "Dr. Fenn, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why didn't you leave with the others? When the collapse happened, you could have escaped. You could have gone with the evacuation fleets." Jakob was quiet for a long moment, studying the small datapad in his hands. On its screen was a photograph of Earth, blue and green and alive, taken long before the fall. "I stayed behind," he said finally, "to make sure someone remembered." "Remembered what?" "How to break the rules." Jacob looked up at the stars, his expression peaceful but determined. "The universe has laws, Nara. Gravity, thermodynamics, conservation of energy. But humans have something the universe doesn't." "Which is?" Jacob smiled, and in that smile was the accumulated mischief of an entire species that had never quite learned to accept that something was impossible. "Humans have the audacity to ask, why not?" He stood up, brushing off his lab coat and heading back toward the bunker. "The universe favors entropy, Nara. Everything falls apart, everything winds down, everything ends." He paused at the entrance, looking back at her with eyes that held the light of distant suns and the promise of infinite possibility. "But humans, we favor mischief." And with that, Dr. Jakob Fenn disappeared back into his bunker, leaving Nara alone with the stars and the comfortable knowledge that somewhere out there, uh, the universe was a little less certain about its own rules than it had been that morning, which was exactly how humanity liked it.